Chet, hi. I think this is going to be the best way for me to answer your questions about Billy Gladstone and my experience with him and a little bit of history about him. Let me start with the fact that I was taken to the Radio City Music Hall somewhere in the 40s, and probably I might have been about 13, 14 years old, and remember the pit coming up. That was, of course, an incredible time to go to the music hall. It was newly built and was the showplace of the nation, as they called themselves then. And to see this stage come up from nowhere and see this very, very tall, handsome guy standing at dress attention for probably the whole show, if I remember correctly, was really something. My own career at the music hall started in 1952 as a substitute player for Harold Farberman and Al Howard. When Raymond Page, I think it was in 1951, got the job as music director, conductor, he decided that he was going to release, fire, non-renewal, whatever word you want to call it, all the older crew in the orchestra, which was probably about 95%. Apparently he wanted to be associated with only very, very young people, and you certainly had to have hair. Billy, of course, had hair, but he just threw the whole bunch out, which was really unfortunate. And again, the union should have stepped in and said, "What the hell are you doing?" But at any rate, Billy, of course, was married to a rockette, and he subsequently, leaving the music hall, he left very, very bitter, a very, very bitter man, and felt it was unjustified, especially when he saw other guys come in, guys like Farberman, who were wonderful players, but very relaxed and took the music hall in the proper stride. It was only a job, and you just played it to the best you can, and that's all. Billy thought that the music hall was his job forever, and he had such an identity with it that you wouldn't believe. As a matter of fact, he had a picture of the music hall orchestra with his own picture superimposed right over the top of the stage. He felt, such an affinity towards the job. I saw that hanging in his house when I went, or his apartment, when I went to buy my drum. But at any rate, Billy left the hall and started making drums, and then had a few contacts. I think he played in the pit. When I recall, it was, I think, My Fair Lady, whatever. And I think he even went out on the road. But at any rate, he left. Farberman came in. I got the job, which was how they got the job, or how I got the job, was incredible. Just a strange sequence of events. At any rate, Farberman at that time bought a drum, was a bird's-eye maple shell, 7 inches. All of Billy's concert snare drums were 7 by 14. He thought that mathematical combination would be the best. At any rate, I was in 1952. I was still at the Juilliard School. I think I was in my last year there, and Morris Arnie Lang, who is the assistant timpani player and cymbal player, percussionist in the New York Philharmonic, found his way to Billy and started studying snare drum. In those days, studying legitimate snare drumming was an art form. Today, very few people want to study the snare drum. Probably for that, I mean, the reason for that was that there wasn't much mallet literature. You played orchestral mallets, Porgy and Bess, whatever. The timpani, there certainly wasn't the plethora of incredible solos that you have today. So the snare drum was a chance for you to have to develop your chops and really show off. And Morris and I were very, very good friends in college. And he told me about this wonderful guy, Billy Gladstone, who's got this wonderful technique and approach to playing the snare drum. And I don't know, I just put it in the back of my head, started thinking about it. One of the things that Billy talked about was a way of holding the left hand as a conventional grip player in such a way so that you can get the most rebound using the index and middle fingers. Again, if we're together someday, I'll show you all the things about Billy's technique that you might want to know. As I said, I kind of with great interest listened to what Morris was telling me and put it aside. Finally, Farberman left the music hall. He went to Boston, and I got the job as the solo percussionist. And knowing I needed a drum, and after having played with on Harold's drum as his sub, he would leave the drum for me. I thought, gee, I think it's time for me to get a Gladstone drum. And I did. I contacted Billy, and he said, why don't you come over to the apartment? I have a few drums that I could show you. Billy's apartment was on 54th Street and 6th Avenue, kind of a new Art Deco apartment house, probably built maybe 5 or 6 years earlier than when I went over there. And no kitchen. As a matter of fact, there was a kitchen with a stove, but for all intents and purposes, Billy and his wife, I forget her name, ate out most of the time. Their whole life was, as I said before, the music hall. You got up in the morning, had breakfast, whatever, and then got to the hall by 12:30 and spent basically all your time there. There was a 2-hour break in between shows. I mean, the feature would start somewhere around 10:30, and then the first show was somewhere around 12:30, and every 2 hours after that there was a show. So you started your day about 12:30 and ended it at 10:30. And since there wasn't too much you could do, you ended up spending your time in the music hall cafeteria or going out to eat with the guys and the girls and having whatever early dinner after the second show. So that was his whole life. And Billy's whole apartment was basically drums, and the kitchen was a place where he had all his gut snares hanging. He'd soak them and then hang them out to dry. And the lightest weights he could get were the flat irons that the Chinese laundry people would use to iron their shirts. They probably weighed no more than about 2 pounds, whatever. But that was just enough for Billy, and the drying process and the hanging process of the gut snares. After which I think what he did was he would take beeswax and wax them and or shellac them so that they would have the right kind of brittle quality and produce the best sound. At any rate, Billy's apartment had, of course, the drums. When I went there, he had a bird's eye maple drum and this black shell drum, which was lacquered. He hated, at the time, the drum manufacturers were putting a plastic kind of laminate over the wood shells. And Billy said, if you want a toilet seat, I mean, those were, I think, his words, if you want a toilet seat, buy a Ludwig drum or a Gretsch drum. My drums, I don't put any plastic on them, and he was even so concerned about the sound and the sound being stifled by the so-called machine lugs that were put out. They were die-cast lugs that best lug he could imitate was the old Ludwig post lug, which had the smallest diameter fitting to disturb the shell. And of course he constructed a drum to meet the needs of his at the music hall. In those days, of course, they used calf heads, and so in an effort to tighten the top head, the batter head, or the snare head, or both at the same time, to bring them up or down, depending upon climatic conditions, he devised that marvelous drum key arrangement and that marvelous tuning arrangement with reverse treads and a hollow tube. His throw-off was the first of its kind. He wanted to be able to play and throw the snares off with a flick of the stick without having to use his hand. So what he did was, as you can see, it comes up just enough for the stick to just flick over on the rim and it would just fall down. Really marvelous. The drum key is so designed with the correct number of threads, so that if you wind the key on with his name showing, it should line up exactly with the plate which had his name on it also. Really ingenious. And then, of course, he had the internal muffler with numbers. Everything was so pristine about him. But that's, in some regards, it really, numbers really didn't matter. But he loved that kind of concept. And I chose the black drum. I thought it looked really very, very classy, and to this day I think the black snare drum is the most dressiest drum you can find, or certainly the what's the word, looked like a grand piano being rolled onto to a stage. It has a wonderful formal look that I think is gorgeous. And of course he had the best plating done, double, maybe triple chrome plating. Everything was done just very, very well. At any rate, I used the drum at the music hall and used it. Basically, there's hardly anything to do at the music hall in terms of real finesse. The playing was really... If I sound like I'm talking in a halting manner, I'm checking my counting dial here so I don't run over time and end up talking into a blank tape. As I said, the little amount of very, very, very refined playing was almost non-existent at the music hall. It was just loud rolls, loud playing. So the drum seemed okay. When I left the music hall and I got a job in Boston, I of course didn't come as the snare drummer. I came as a bass drummer and utility percussionist with mainly bass drum. That was my post. I played that. I joined the orchestra in 1956, and then in 1960, Farberman left, and I became the principal snare drummer. The few times I did use the drum, I really wasn't that cognizant of really refined needs. Harold actually was using his drum, and when I brought my drum out, they both sounded fairly fairly good, fairly same kind of, giving me the same kind of response. But when I got the job as the snare drummer, for some particular reason, I remember hearing Buster Bailey, who was the snare drummer in the New York Philharmonic, remember hearing him play on a drum, and that drum sounded spectacular, had more wire sound. And I called Buster and I said, what kind of drum are you using? Buster, by the way, never owned a Gladstone drum. He said, I'm using a drum made for me by Forrest Clark, who is a drum maker out in California. And I think Forrest at the time was a snare drummer with the LA Philharmonic. So I wrote to Forrest, and Forrest spoke with him on the phone, as a matter of fact, and Forrest said, yeah, I'll make you a drum. I got to look around for post lugs, and I got to look around for, basically he copied Billy's throw-off also. Forrest did make me a drum, and I started using that drum almost exclusively because it had a pianissimo in the lower range that was absolutely incredible. When Billy was making drums, you either had all gut or all wire, or, excuse me, the third possibility was wire wound silk. But they really weren't that refined. When I say refined, I mean the refinement in sound to produce the minutest pianissimo or pianissimos, excuse me. The gut drums just don't have it. And so I used that for a long time, and then realized that, gee, I've got this great Gladstone drum. Why don't I do something? Forrest drum was a 5.5-inch shell. Why don't I go ahead and get him to make me, to convert my Gladstone drum? Prior to that, though, I met Bobby Grasso, who was making Fives drums. And when he heard my Forrest Clark drum, he said, oh, I can build you a better drum. I can outdo that, whatever. And all that brouhaha, and he was he was very, very good, as a matter of fact. And unfortunately, he really didn't work out some of the design problems, and so that the drum sounds great, but in some cases it really is out of square when you look at the way the snares come into the head. But the drum did sound really great. He used guitar strands. This is when he was working, or he sold his company to the Martin Guitar Company, and they got in and started to make Fives drums. When I told him about my drum, he said, look, you know what, why don't you bring that drum, and maybe we can get it sounding a little bit brighter, and let me fiberglass the inside for you. It really will help a great deal. We tried that, and the drum still sounded very, very dark. To this day, it sounds nice and dark. Then I called Forrest and said, look, I've got the drum fiberglassed. What do you think? Let's try putting on the dual gut and wire snares with individually tensioned. And that's what you have today. You have a fiberglass inside, and you can see how well the individual tensions work. And so that's about it. That's the history of the drum. When I got the drum back, it still didn't have, maybe because the drum is so deep, didn't have that infinite sensitivity that a 5.5 or 6-inch drum will provide. So the drum actually sat for the longest time in my locker. I would truck it out occasionally if there was some dark quality. I think we played Mahler Symphony, Mahler 5th or 6th Symphony, and I used it. But again, most of the time I used my Forrest Clark or the Fives drum, and now I'm using a drum that Neil Grover is made. None of them, of course, with the possible exception of forest drums, have anywhere near the beauty of Billy's drum. Billy's drum is absolutely, and when you think about when he was making these drums, 1950, they are absolutely, it was incredible, just the benchmark of what a custom-made drum should be. I guess he went on and made some drums, a full set of drums for Cozy Cole, I think, has a set. I think maybe he did the same for Louis Bellson, maybe for Krupa. I don't know if Buddy Rich had a set, but there it is. So let's see, questions. What performances were? Oh, the drum. I used the drum on a couple of performances I did of the Bartok Sonata for 2 piano and percussion. As I said, I used it for some very, very dark pieces, Mahler symphonies. If I look back, I probably could tell you a few more times I used drum, but there were nothing monumental that created a stir. I've trucked it out thinking, maybe I'll try it again, let's see, but no, it just doesn't have that low-range pianissimo response that I feel a drum needs. But it's a classic, and you own it, and I hope that you enjoy owning it and playing on it. And by the way, the little plastic $50 top that you find on top of the head is in an effort to take out some of the rings. So at that nodal point, we started experimenting years ago with it. We started doing that with timpani, and I thought, well, maybe we'll do the same thing with the snare drum. But that too still hasn't eliminated the ring. You need the ring on a drum. One thing I tell people who come and coach with me is that you really can't be concerned about what the drum sounds like 2 feet or 3 feet away from where you're playing it. You've got to hear a drum in a hall and stand at least 30, 40, 50 feet away for you to get an idea of what the drum sounds like. Drives people crazy. They have a drum and they listen to the drum and they get so not paranoid, but they get so itchy about what a drum sounds like when they're right on top of it. And I'll tell them, walk across the stage and tell me what you think now. And by golly, drum sounds good. What else? I don't know. I hope that you enjoy the drum, and if there's anything else I can talk with you about, then please don't hesitate. Someday, soon, if I come out to California, it would be nice to get together and spend a couple of hours just talking and rapping about Billy. So, best love to your family, and I'll be talking with you. Bye-bye.